Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. So evidently, E3 is dead. And I wasn't originally going to do a video on this, but after seeing what a lot of other people have been saying about it, it turns out that I have the hot take. Which is not unusual, but let's just get into it. So this was even announced in sort of a weird way, right? It was just some PR guy from Razer, like the mouse and keyboard company, who came out and just tweeted that E3 would not be having either a physical or a digital showcase this year. And then I think it was like a day or two after the ESA, the people who host E3, if you didn't know that, came out and basically confirmed it. And they said, hey, we're not going to have a show this year, either in person or even digitally, which is a real bummer. It means that this is going to be the first June, or the first summer at least, since 1995 to not have an E3. That is literally my entire lifetime, right? I was born in August of 1994, which means the first June, I assume it was in June the whole time, I guess it may not have been, that I would have lived through would have been the June of 1995, which is the first E3. So literally in the entire time that I've been alive, there has been an E3 up until this year. And that feels really bad. I don't like that, you know? And they part of this that most people reporting on this seem to have just completely skipped over is the part where the ESA also said, hey, we're going to be back in 2023. We're just revamping what we're doing. We're figuring out the problems with the structure that we built. And then we're going to come back bigger and better in 2023, which I, for one, very much hope happens. Because E3 is so important to the games industry. And for some reason, people have been ignoring that fact. You know, E3 has, and with any luck always will be, the Christmas of video games. We have other shows throughout the years, right? Throughout the year we have XO. We used to have PSX, Gamescom. Hell, even PAX to an extent are these other video game shows, and they're all great in their own ways. But none of them did what E3 did. E3 was the one time of the year where every single person in the games industry came together to put together a massive blowout show to show off what they're working on and to compete against each other to see who was going to capitalize on that mind share for the year, right? It is something unique in the game space. And some people will argue that E3 has been dead or dying for a long time because, they'll point fingers at the different companies that have left throughout the years. They'll say, oh, well, Nintendo left a long time ago and they started just doing their own Nintendo Direct. And that is true, but they always had a spot on the floor, a huge spot on the floor. They just moved their showcase to a Direct, which is probably for the best because honestly, a lot of their showcases were a little awkward and having it pre-recorded was probably a good thing for them. And then EA left, but really they just moved down the street, right? It was still there. It was still part of the same experience. They just weren't paying the ESA for the space. And it's the same thing with Microsoft. They left, but they were just across the street. You could even use the same ticket from E3 to get into the Microsoft event. They just held it in their own theater, right? And, when you consider that, if anything, you could argue that E3 wasn't dying, it was getting bigger, at least geographically speaking. The one thing that really detracted from it was when PlayStation left, right? PlayStation, one of the big three, one of the most important companies in the games industry, they just up and left, right? They had one really bad show. It was that one where they brought in like a flute guy and a banjo guy to just like fill for time, and then they had a weird like transition where people who were there in person had to go on a hike through the city to get to a separate location for the second half of the show, and all of us watching at home just got to watch like a short little panel of like two reporters and I think Sean Layden just talking about what we had already seen, and it was super awkward. And so of course everyone lambasted them for it, right? They were like, this was not a good show. This was, it was drawn out with weird musical numbers. The people who were there were like not happy because they had to go up and go for a hike. The people who were watching at home didn't like it because there was that weird intermission in the middle. Like, it was bad all across the board, and PlayStation, I guess, just could not take the heat from having a bad show, which everyone's had a bad show, but they couldn't take the heat from this bad show. And so they just took their ball and they went home like a child, right? And you know, even without PlayStation having all of these shows back to back, it was an event to look forward to. It was great. It's the one time of the year where all eyes are on the games industry, just across the board. Everyone is looking. But if there's no E3, then video game Christmas doesn't exist anymore. And I think we can all agree that like that would not be a good thing, right? Losing the biggest holiday in video games, there's no positive way to spin that, right? Which is why I'm so confused and honestly a little upset that there's so many people online trying to do exactly that, trying to like celebrate the death of E3. And which doesn't make any sense to me because A, the ESA has already told us, like, hey, we're going to be back next year. We're figuring out all the problems that the people have with E3, which, to be fair, it does have quite a few problems. I'm not saying E3 was perfect. And they're going to try and come back with those problems fixed next year in a bigger, revamped sort of way. And B, I have yet to hear a single good reason for why E3 dying is positive, right? I've heard, oh, E3's been dying for years, which I feel like I've already addressed. It's definitely been changing, and you could argue that it has been becoming worse, but it's definitely not dying. Like, it was still extremely popular. Everyone was watching it. It was making probably more money than ever, so it definitely wasn't dying. But I can see people saying that it needs to change, which is why I'm overall happy that they are taking steps to change those things. I've heard, and this one really irritates me, E3 was dead as soon as they started letting fans in. Like, this is an opinion that I assume is only held by journalists who were there before they let fans in. And it's this sort of like elitist, like, keep the peasants out mentality that just really irritates me, because it's like, hey, I get that this used to be your thing, and that letting fans in means that now you have to share, and that now you don't get as much stuff for free. But like, how selfish do you have to be for you to be like, oh, well, the show's dead now because I don't get my free jacket or whatever? And like, the one part of that I agree with is, you know, evidently the ESA has not been doing a great job of making sure that the journalists have the time that they need to do things. You know, like, they should be giving the journalists, you know, early access for a day, or early access in the morning of every day, or something like that, so that they can get to all of the different games that they want to play and get their articles written up, because that is a very important aspect of it. And so I agree with that. But the idea of like, oh, it's been going downhill since they let the fans in, like, shut up. How selfish can you be? Like, God forbid the consumers, who are arguably one of the most important parts of the games industry, God forbid they get a chance to like see the games or be a part of the show, or like, whatever. I just hate it. Then there's E3 is too expensive, which, like, that one I do kind of agree with, actually, where it's like, do they charge their vendors and the publishers too much for the floor space that they take up? Probably. But I feel like that's the same with any convention. If you go to a Comic-Con or a FanFest or anything like that, the vendors who are there paid for the spot that they're in. You know, that's not unique. Now, is the ESA charging more than usual for those spots? Probably yes, but I would wager that it's less than vendors are spending to have spots at like San Diego Comic-Con. E3 is just a bigger show, and because it's a bigger show, you are paying more for that spot, because the spot that you're paying for is effectively an advertisement for your company, right? And it's also an opportunity for you to make that money back from things like merch sales on like t-shirts or pins or whatever it is, right? Art prints in the case of Comic-Con more often than not. So like, I understand people saying it's too expensive, but it being expensive is not unique to E3. That is the case of every single convention. And then it's too much work, right? There's all the journalists who are like, oh, we always have to crunch whenever we go to E3. There's so much news, and we struggle to cover all of it. And it's like, okay, well, that's not really a problem with E3. That's a problem with your company. That is your company either not sending enough people or asking you to cover more things than are reasonable for you to cover for the number of people that are there. So like, hey, let's call a spade a spade. If your company is telling you to cover 50 things in one day for one person, that's unreasonable. But that's not E3's fault. Okay, so let's not pin that on them. And then my favorite one, because it's the one that I think makes the least sense, is now we can get a replacement show. And my problem with that is that we've seen a couple of replacement shows pop up, and all of them suck, right? Because like, let's look at all the different replacement shows that we've had, right? You know, the most obvious one is Summer Game Fest, which is effectively just Jeff Keighley taking a lot of other shows and slapping them onto his Google Docs calendar and then live reacting to them with a couple interviews here and there after the fact. You know, he has one showcase of his own that he slips in there. I forget what it's called. But that showcase is mostly just like, first of all, bad, because all of the big companies are still doing their own shows. And second of all, it's like mostly advertisements. You know, just like the Game Awards, it's like mostly advertisements because he's just trying to make money because it's his job, right? So he's showing off all these advertisements. He's probably charging the companies who show things in his showcase for being in his showcase, which, to be fair, is also an advertisement cost because a ton of people watch his show. But it's really just Jeff Keighley raking in money hand over fist, right? So let's not pretend that he's doing anything heroic by creating Summer Game Fest, all right? Like, it's his job. And then, you know, even without Summer Game Fest, those scattered shows are still happening, and a lot of those scattered shows are also really bad, right? You look at it and it's like Square Enix probably didn't need to have a show the last, 2 years that they had a show. They just did not have enough to justify it. Or like Koch Media had one last year, which I think was technically part of E3, but like very loosely. You know, these scattered shows are so disorganized and so hard to follow that Jeff Grubb, who I love despite all of his leaks, which I don't love, you know, he has his own version of it, which is literally just a Google Calendar called Summer Game Mess. Like everyone knows that Summer Game Fest is bad, so let's not pretend that it's a replacement for E3. And then, you know, other people have brought up the idea of like everyone doing their own sort of Nintendo Direct style thing, like State of Play style thing. And I think that those work as different things to have throughout the year, but not as a replacement for E3. Because you lose something by not having a live crowd. You lose something by not having people losing their minds when you announce new things on stage, right? Like whenever you don't have people freaking out because you just announced God of War, or because there's a new Spider-Man game, right? Or because, oh, Mario's back, right? Like, if you don't get the live reaction of that, you are missing something palpable that E3 brought to the table that you just don't get anywhere else. So I think I've made it pretty clear that I love E3, and I hope that it comes back next year bigger and stronger than ever, and that people fall back in love with it and it rises back to the heights that it was before the pandemic. But I've also been thinking about, what if it doesn't, right? And so I was trying to think of what a good replacement might look like. And it's really come down to a handful of things. I think that it needs to have an in-person aspect. The showcases need to be in person so that people get the chance to react to it live, so that you get that energy from the crowd. I think that you need to have a floor space where people can walk around and be like, I'm going to go over to the Nintendo section, I'm going to go over to the EA section, the Ubisoft section, whatever, right? And have it feel like a video game amusement park almost, right? And the other thing is, I feel like you need to be able to ensure that there's a large enough portion of the games industry there. It doesn't need to be everybody. You know, if PlayStation still wants to go and take their ball and run 2 months down the road and have their own show there, that's fine. We just need to have a big enough group of the industry to make it feel like it's the majority, right? And I was trying to think of some companies that could do that, and really the only one that came to mind that I liked was Microsoft. And I know people are going to be like, oh, you're an Xbox guy, whatever. I am. But still, when you look at it, and it's like, Microsoft is huge, and they acquired Bethesda. They're in the process of acquiring Activision, so they're already a big enough company to put on a show with just those 3 entities and have it feel like a big deal. And if they're that big, they could very easily reach out and be like, hey, EA, do you want to come over and like hang out? I'm having a party. You want to come down? Ubisoft, you want to come? Devolver, you want to come? And I feel like if they did that, and they could hold it at the Microsoft Theater, which is just right across the street from where E3 was before, I feel like if they did that, it would just be E3 again, but under a different name. And they would probably charge less, because like Microsoft doesn't need to charge Nintendo to show up. They don't need to charge EA to show up, right? But even if there isn't a big show like that, I do feel like Microsoft would be fine, is the one thing. You know, that's the reason why I think they might not do something like that, is because they have acquired Bethesda, because they are acquiring Activision, they already sort of have 3 big shows throughout the year, right? They're going to still continue doing a showcase in June. Like, we already know that they're doing that. I don't see any reason why they would stop doing that. They have EXO in November. There's BlizzCon and QuakeCon. If you spread those out to be in, you know, the 4 different quarters, you can have, you know, Xbox can just run the sort of like the mind share from all of the news cycle. That's the word I was looking for, the news cycle. They can run the news cycle for huge portions of the entire year just from those 4 shows. So I don't know necessarily that they would need to. It's just the one thing that I could think of that might still be good. But that's just my thoughts on it. Honestly, if you guys have another idea for what a really good replacement E3 could be and who could run it, I would really love to hear about that in the comments below. And also, just in general, how do you feel about the idea of E3 skipping a year or being gone forever? You know, this is sort of a big deal in the games industry, and I would really love to know what you guys think about it. And of course, if you like this kind of content and you want to see more from me, please like this video, share it with a friend, subscribe to the channel, because it really, really helps me out, and it really motivates me to do these videos more often, which is something that I have struggled with, because I do, of course, also work about 50 hours a week on top of trying to do this. So I do really appreciate any sort of help or feedback I can get from you guys. But until next time, I'll see you around.